Leave the Porsche! My sister screamed as I backed out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, I saw Tessa running after me in wedge sandals that kept slipping against the gravel, one hand raised like she still believed the world stopped when she gave an order. My mother stood on the porch with both hands pressed to her chest. My father stayed near the front steps, silent, stiff, watching me leave the house he had just told me to get out of. My 4-year-old son, Eli, sat behind me in his car seat, quiet in a way children should never have to be quiet. His little green dinosaur was clutched in both hands, pressed so tightly against his chest that I could see his knuckles whitening in the mirror. "Mommy," he whispered, "is Aunt Tessa mad about the car?" I kept both hands on the wheel. "Yes, baby," I said, "but that is not your worry." The Porsche Macan rolled past the mailbox, past the dogwood tree my grandmother had planted 30 years earlier, past the folding chairs still scattered across my backyard from my father's retirement party. Paper plates were still on the tables. Lemonade glasses still sweated in the September heat. 10 minutes earlier, those same relatives had watched my father point toward the front door and tell me to apologize or take my boy and get out. So I did. What none of them understood was that the Porsche did not belong to Tessa. It did not belong to my parents. And the brick colonial behind them, the house they had just ordered me to leave, had never belonged to my father either. By 9:15 the next morning, my attorney would explain that to them in a voice calm enough to make the truth sound heavier than anger. But before that call, before the deed, the title, and the emails they never thought I would see, there was that driveway. And my sister screaming for me to leave what was never hers. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 5% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. 30 minutes earlier, the backyard still looked like a family celebration. My father's retirement banner hung crooked between the porch posts, the left side lifting every time the September breeze moved through. Tessa noticed it first, complained that it looked cheap, then walked away with her drink. I was the one who climbed onto the step stool in my navy dress and pressed fresh tape against the wood. By then, I already smelled like lemon cleaner, charcoal smoke, and the kind of exhaustion nobody mentions when the party is not supposed to be about you. I had been awake since 5:10 that morning. The night before, I had finished a 12-hour hospice shift with a man whose daughter kept asking how to know when the end was close. Saturday morning, I had been at guard medic training, running drills until my shoulders burned. After that, I came home, cleaned the kitchen, marinated the chicken, washed guest towels, and set the yard for people who would later sit there watching my father tell me to leave it. My mother moved through the party like the house belonged to her memories instead of my grandmother's will. Beverly Ellison adjusted serving spoons, corrected the drink table, and laughed just loudly enough for everyone to hear she was in charge. When Aunt Marlene said the place looked beautiful, my mother smiled and said, "Russell always made sure this family had somewhere to gather." I stood near the kitchen door with a tray in my hands, waiting for someone to hear how wrong that sentence was. No one did. My father stood by the grill accepting compliments like mortgage payments he had never made. Uncle Dennis clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You did good, Russ. A house like this says something." My father only turned a piece of chicken and nodded. That was how the lie survived in our family. Not as one big announcement. Just a small silence, repeated at the right moments, until everyone started calling it history. Grandma June had bought that brick colonial in 1984 after 26 years of cutting hair in a shop that smelled like coffee, hairspray, and winter coats. She had left it to me because I was the one who stayed when her body started failing. I drove her to dialysis. I changed sheets at midnight, though learned which hallway board creaked loud enough to wake her. My parents visited when it was convenient. Tessa sent flowers twice and called that effort love. Tessa arrived late, with Caleb carrying the cooler behind her, and their daughters dressed like every family photograph had to be approved before it happened. She kissed my mother's cheek, glanced across the backyard, and said, "This place could be amazing with proper lighting." I told her it was already a home, She smiled without looking at me. I meant for events, Mara. Don't be so sensitive. A few minutes later, I found her near the basement door, telling Caleb the old sewing room had character. The old sewing room was where Grandma June taught me to hem my own uniform pants because, she said, a woman should know how to fix what the world expected her to replace. Hearing Tessa discuss that room like empty square footage made something tighten behind my ribs. I should have closed the door. I should have told her that my grandmother's house was not available for her next idea, her next image, or her next rescue plan. Instead, I carried another tray outside and told myself it was not worth ruining Dad's retirement party. I had said that kind of thing to myself for years. Not worth it. Let it pass. Keep the peace. But peace, I would learn that afternoon, was not what I had been keeping. I had only been teaching them that the first insult would cost them nothing. Beverly crouched beside Eli on the bottom porch step, where he was lining up his plastic dinosaurs along the edge of a paper plate. She smoothed his hair with the same gentle hand she used in church when people were watching. One day, she said, loud enough for the nearest table to hear, you'll understand your grandfather kept this roof over your head. Eli looked up at her, then across the yard at me, and that was the moment the air changed. I set the tray down carefully enough that the cups stopped rattling. Mom, I said, don't say something untrue to my son. The conversations around us thinned. My mother rose slowly, one hand drifting to her collarbone like I had wounded her. After everything this family has been through, she said, you choose your father's retirement party to embarrass us? I kept my voice even. I asked you not to lie to Eli. Tessa stepped in before my mother could answer. You always do this, she said. Everyone is having a nice day, and you find a way to make yourself the victim. I looked at my sister, then at the relatives, pretending not to watch. I'm not making myself anything, I said. I'm correcting something that should have been corrected years ago. That was when my father put the grill tongs down. The small metal sound quieted the yard, faster than shouting would have. Russell Ellison walked toward me with the tight public expression I knew too well, the one that meant he would discuss my feelings later, but only after I helped protect his pride now. Mara, he said, low and controlled. Apologize to your mother and your sister. I asked, for what? His jaw shifted. Behind him, Tessa folded her arms. My mother looked away as if my question had hurt too much to bear. For making a scene, he said. I looked around the yard. Caleb near the basement door with his phone in his hand, Aunt Marlene staring into her lemonade, Eli standing by the step with his dinosaurs forgotten beside his knee. I didn't make a scene, I said. I told the truth. My father's voice dropped colder. Then take your boy and get out. The words were not loud. That made them worse. He said them like he had the right. Eli whispered, Mommy? That one word settled everything in me. I walked to him, lifted him into my arms, and felt his legs wrap around my waist. I did not explain the deed. I did not mention Grandma June. I did not tell my father he had just ordered me out of a house he had never owned. I only said, okay. Then I carried my son through the back door, past the kitchen where my mother's serving spoons still lay in the sink, and took Eli's overnight bag from the hall closet. My father followed us as far as the porch. He did not stop me. My father did not follow us to the car. That told me more than any apology would have. Russell Ellison had enough authority to order his daughter out in front of relatives, but not enough courage to stand in the driveway and watch what those words meant. My mother stayed on the porch. Tessa came farther, saying I was dramatic, that I had embarrassed everyone, that I always knew how to ruin a day meant for someone else. I buckled Eli into his car seat, without answering her. When Tessa screamed for me to leave the Porsche, Eli flinched. That was the only moment I almost turned around. Not because of the car, and not because of my sister. Because my son had heard enough adults use anger like ownership for one afternoon. I closed his door gently, walked around to the driver's side, and got in with my hands steady, only because I forced them to be. The engine sounded too loud in the silence that followed. I drove 18 minutes to Lydia Voss's townhouse on the edge of Salem. Lydia had been my best friend since nursing school, the kind of woman who opened the door before you finished knocking because she could read disaster from the way headlights crossed her curtains. She did not ask questions in front of Eli. She only crouched down and said, "Hey, buddy. I have apple juice and the good crackers." Eli nodded like a child who had decided politeness was safer than crying. Once he was settled on Lydia's couch with a blanket and cartoons turned low, I stepped into the kitchen and finally let my shoulders drop. Lydia put a mug of tea in front of me. I did not drink it. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic because I needed something warm to hold. "Do they know?" she asked quietly. I looked toward the living room, where Eli was sitting too still for a 4-year-old. "They know what they chose to believe," I said. Before I called anyone, I texted my parents. I wrote carefully, because anger leaves records too. "Eli is safe. We are at Lydia's. You may video call tomorrow at 6 if the conversation stays calm and no adult issues are discussed with him." I read it twice before sending. Then I sent the same message to Tessa, though every part of me wanted to send nothing at all. Whatever happened next, I would not let them say I had hidden my son to punish them. No one replied for 26 minutes. Then my mother sent one line. "Your father deserves an apology before anything else." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Lydia reached toward my phone, not to take it, just to remind me I did not have to answer every hook they dropped in front of me, so I placed the phone face down on the counter. For the first time that day, I let the silence belong to me. That night, after Eli fell asleep, I opened my laptop at Lydia's kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and an occasional car passing outside. I pulled up the folder I had kept for years but hoped never to need. Grandma June's will, the deed, the Porsche title, property tax receipts, insurance records, repair invoices, and the bank documents tracing the car purchase back to the land near Smith Mountain Lake. At 7:42 the next morning, I called Nadine Whitaker, the estate attorney who had handled Grandma June's paperwork after the funeral. Nadine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. "Is Eli safe?" "Yes." "Did you tell them where he is?" "Yes." "Has anyone asked you to sign anything involving the house?" I thought of Tessa by the basement door, Caleb with his phone, and my mother's careful smile. "Not yet," I said. Nadine was quiet for half a second. "Then we move before they do." She did not say it like a threat. She said it like a woman closing a door before a storm reached the room. By 8:30, I had emailed her every document. By 9, she had reviewed enough to know the ownership records were not complicated. And at 9:15, while my father was probably still expecting me to come home ashamed, Nadine Whitaker placed the first call that would make shame land where it belonged. At 9:15, Nadine called my father first. She told me later that Russell answered on the second ring, already irritated, as if a lawyer's name on his phone was another problem I had created. My mother was with him. Tessa was there too, probably sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, waiting for me to come back, embarrassed enough to give the apology my father believed he was owed. Nadine did not raise her voice. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "I represent Mara regarding the protection of her separate property and any related family communications after yesterday's incident." My father cut in before she finished. He said I had taken his grandson without permission, driven away in a vehicle that belonged to the family, and turned a private disagreement into something ugly. Nadine let him finish because people often tell you exactly who they are when they think they are making their strongest point. Then she said, "Mara informed you of Eli's location in writing and offered a video call. That is not concealment. As for the vehicle, I strongly suggest no one in your household describe the Porsche as family property again until you review the title." There was silence on the line. My mother spoke next, softer but not calmer. "That car was bought after June passed. Everything June left was meant to help the family." "That is not what the documents say," Nadine answered. "The 2019 Porsche Macan is titled solely to Mara Ellison. The purchase funds traced to the sale of inherited land near Smith Mountain Lake. There is no lien, no co-owner, and no legal interest held by Russell, Beverly, or Tessa Ellison Reed. I was sitting at Lydia's kitchen table when Nadine told me this later, but I could picture my father standing too fast, and Tessa waiting for someone to say the lawyer was wrong. Then Nadine moved to the house. The Roanoke County property is also Mara's separate property. The deed was transferred through the estate of June Calloway. It is mortgage-free, titled only in Mara's name, and has never belonged to Russell Ellison. My father said, "That house has always been part of this family." Nadine's reply was quiet. Emotionally, perhaps. Legally, no. That sentence stayed with me because it named the confusion they had used for years. They treated memory like ownership. They treated gatherings like payments. They treated my grandmother's open door as if it had erased the will she signed, when her hands were still steady enough to write her name. Nadine also told them no one was to attempt to sell, transfer, borrow against, or use the property as collateral. That last word must have landed somewhere, because she said Tessa went silent in a way lawyers learn to notice. My father asked if I was trying to ruin him. The question hurt more than I expected, not because it was new, but because it was old. In my family, accountability always arrived wearing the mask of betrayal. If you named what someone had done, you were cruel. If you protected yourself, you were selfish. If you refused to pretend, you were destroying the family. Nadine answered for me. "No, Mr. Ellison. Mara is preserving her property, her records, and her son's stability." After the call, Nadine phoned me. Eli was eating toast at Lydia's counter, swinging his feet beneath the stool. The morning light was soft on his hair. Nothing about that room looked like a battlefield, and somehow that made the whole thing feel sadder. "They were angry," Nadine said, "but they heard me. If this moves toward custody or litigation, I'll bring in the right counsel. For this morning, the ownership records were enough." I looked at the folder open beside my laptop. Grandma June's will sat on top, her signature near the bottom of the page. I had imagined that hearing a lawyer say the house was mine would make me feel powerful. It did not. It made me tired. The deed had not changed overnight. The title had not appeared because I got angry. The only new thing was that I had stopped letting my family speak over paper that had been telling the truth for years. Grandma June's signature stayed in my mind long after Nadine hung up. It was smaller than I remembered her handwriting being, but still steady. June Calloway had never owned much that looked impressive from the road. The house was a 3-bedroom brick colonial with a stubborn back door, a basement that smelled faintly of fabric dust, and a dogwood tree that dropped white petals across the driveway every spring. But she had paid for every inch of it, one haircut, one shampoo set, one winter tip at a time. When her health started failing, I was 24 and working nights at a rehab facility outside Roanoke. I would leave work at 7 a.m., stop for coffee I could barely taste, then drive to her house before dialysis. Grandma June never asked me to come. That was part of her pride. She would say, "You have your own life, baby," while leaving the porch light on because she knew I would be there before sunrise. I learned the rhythm of her medicines, the sound of her breathing, the way pain made her polite. My parents visited, but mostly when there was something to celebrate or photograph. Beverly brought casseroles and dishes she took home before dessert. Russell fixed a loose cabinet handle once, and mentioned it for 3 Thanksgivings. Tessa sent flowers with cards that said "thinking of you," then called me later to ask how Grandma looked. As if illness were something she could keep at a safe distance through description. I used to defend them in my head. Everyone handles sickness differently. Everyone is busy. Everyone means well. But Grandma June saw more than I wanted her to. One February night, the heat went out, and I sat beside her bed wearing 2 sweaters while waiting for the repairman. She looked toward the hallway and said, "People like a home when it is warm and full. Pay attention to who shows up when it is cold." I laughed then because I thought she was talking about the furnace. She was not. By then, she had already started separating kindness from performance. The summer before she died, she asked me to take her to the county office. She wore lipstick, even though her hands shook while she put it on. I thought we were updating a medical form. Instead, we met Nadine Whitaker for the first time. Grandma June signed papers slowly, resting between pages, but she never looked confused. On the drive home, she touched the envelope in her lap and said, "This house needs someone who understands it is not a stage." I did not know she meant me until after the funeral, when Nadine read the will in her office, and my mother went quiet in a way that frightened me more than tears would have. Russell said I was young for that kind of responsibility. Beverly said blessings should never make one child forget the rest of the family. Tessa hugged me with one arm and whispered, "Don't worry, we'll help you figure out what to do with it." Even then, they were not hearing what Grandma June had done, they were hearing an opening. For years, I let them gather there because I wanted the house to remain what Grandma loved, a place with food on the counter, children in the yard, and lights glowing after dark. I paid the taxes. I replaced the water heater. I patched the porch steps Walter Briggs warned me would rot through if I waited another winter. My family came for birthdays, cookouts, and holidays, and each time they left calling it ours. I never corrected them loudly enough. That was my mistake. Not because the deed was unclear, but because silence gave their entitlement room to decorate itself like gratitude. The next morning, Nadine asked permission to look beyond the deed and title. Not because the ownership was unclear, but because Tessa's silence on the word collateral had not felt innocent. People react differently when a door closes, Nadine told me. Some accept the door, some start looking for a window. I gave her access to the emails I had forwarded over the years from family accounts, old messages about repairs, taxes, insurance, anything connected to the house. I thought she would find irritation. I did not expect a plan. The email came from Caleb Reed, sent 3 weeks before my father's retirement party. It was addressed to Russell, with Tessa copied in. The subject line was simple: bridge loan option. The words underneath were not. Caleb had written, "If Mara signs a simple authorization, the Roanoke property can support the loan. She does not need to understand every detail. We just need her cooperation before Friday." I read that sentence 3 times, not because I misunderstood it, but because I understood it too clearly. Tessa's event planning business was not between seasons, the way Beverly had been saying at church. It was bleeding. 2 canceled weddings, 1 failed corporate contract, and a venue deposit dispute had left her owing nearly $61,000 to vendors who had stopped accepting promises. Caleb, a mortgage broker who cared deeply about how numbers looked on paper, had started calling it a timing issue, but the email made it plain. Their timing issue was supposed to become my signature. I sat at Lydia's kitchen table while Eli colored beside me, pressing a blue crayon too hard against the page. My phone rang with my mother's name. I let it ring once, twice, then answered because part of me still wanted Beverly to say there had been a misunderstanding. She did not. Her voice was wet and careful. "Your sister is in real trouble, Mara. This family cannot survive another public embarrassment right now." "Were you going to tell me the house could be at risk?" I asked. She went quiet long enough for the refrigerator hum to sound loud. Then she said, "We thought you would do the right thing." The right thing. In my family, that phrase usually meant the thing that cost me something and spared Tessa the consequences. Beverly started talking about Tessa's daughters, about Russell's blood pressure, about how Grandma June would have wanted us united. I looked at Eli's bent head and the small hand moving that crayon back and forth. "My sister has children," Beverly said finally. "You have to think beyond yourself." "So do I said. She sighed like I had disappointed her again. "Mara, you know what I mean." I did know. That was the worst part. She meant Tessa's life was full enough to protect, and mine was flexible enough to borrow from. She meant Eli's roof could become negotiable if Tessa's reputation was at stake. She meant the house my grandmother left me could be dressed up as family help until the risk landed only on my name. I ended the call without raising my voice. Then I looked at Nadine's email again, at the word simple authorization, and felt something inside me go still. Not cold, clear. The email should have been the worst of it. For a few hours, I let myself believe it was. Caleb had wanted my signature, Tessa had wanted rescue, and my parents had wanted me soft enough to confuse pressure with love. That was already enough betrayal for one family. But Nadine had a habit of following paper until it stopped moving. Before we respond formally, she said, I want you to review every account connected to the house and to Eli. I expected ordinary discomfort. Maybe a few charges my mother had explained badly. Maybe one transfer I had forgotten approving during a busy week. What arrived in my inbox that afternoon was 22 months of small withdrawals, quiet enough to hide under the noise of regular life. They were not dramatic amounts. That almost made them worse. $420 labeled Mom Medical, $750 labeled Vendor Deposit, $300 for Church Fundraiser, $1,100 for Tessa Emergency, $650 for Dad Reimbursement. By the time Nadine added them together, the number was $18,740. I stared at it until the digits stopped looking like money and started looking like dates I had missed. A Saturday shift I had picked up. A birthday gift I had postponed buying for myself. A repair I had delayed because I thought Eli's savings mattered more. The account had not been rich, but it had been careful. It was where I kept money for house repairs, school costs, and the kind of emergencies single mothers learn to imagine before anyone else does. I called my father first. He answered like he had been waiting for me to calm down and return to the role he understood. Mara, he said, before you start, your mother is very upset. I looked at the spreadsheet on Lydia's table. Why did $18,740 leave my account? There was a pause, then a chair moved on his end. That money was not stolen, he said. It was temporary help. Temporary help. That was what he called it. Not permission ignored. Not trust broken. Not money moved from a child's future into an adult's mistakes. I asked why he had not come to me directly. His answer was immediate, almost just sacked, almost relieved, as if he had been carrying it ready, because you would have made it complicated. I closed my eyes. That sentence hurt more than the total. He had not forgotten to ask me. He had decided my answer would get in the way. Beverly came on the line next. I could hear her crying before she said my name. Your sister was drowning, she said. We did what families do. I wanted to ask why family had not meant protecting Eli's account. I wanted to ask why Tessa's embarrassment had become more urgent than my consent. Instead, I said, you used money I was saving for my son. My mother whispered, you always land on your feet, Mara. There it was, the family doctrine in one sentence. Because I survived, they treated me as available. Because I worked, they treated my paycheck as flexible. Because I did not collapse loudly, they assumed nothing they took could really hurt me. I looked into the living room where Eli was building a crooked tower with Lydia's coasters, completely unaware that adults who claimed to love him had considered his stability easier to borrow from than Tessa's pride. Nadine told me not to move the remaining balance in anger. Clean hands matter, she said. So I did what I had learned to do in hospice rooms when fear rose too fast. I slowed down. I redirected my future paychecks into a new account. I downloaded every statement. I turned on transaction alerts. I opened a separate savings account for Eli that no one in my family could touch. Then I left the old balance exactly where it was, not because I trusted them, but because documentation was stronger than revenge. That night, after Eli fell asleep, I sat in Lydia's kitchen with the bank records spread out in front of me. The numbers did not shout. They did not chase me down a driveway. They simply sat there, patient and plain, telling the part of the story my family had hoped would stay too small to notice. I had spent years believing the danger was the one big demand I might refuse. I was wrong. Sometimes betrayal arrives $300 at a time. 9 days after my sister screamed in the driveway, we met in the small counseling room behind Reverend Allen Pike's church. It was not a courtroom, but it felt closer to one than any room with a coffee machine and a basket of peppermints should have. 4 upholstered chairs faced a low table. A box of tissues sat in the center, like someone had already decided which of us would need them. There were no family photos on the walls, no familiar kitchen, no backyard, no place for my parents to pretend they owned the air. Nadine sat beside me with a thin folder closed on her lap. Walter Briggs came too, wearing his old fire department jacket even though the morning was warm. He had lived next door to Grandma June for 28 years and had seen more truth through his kitchen window than my relatives had managed to admit in a decade. Russell arrived first, jaw tight. Beverly came in holding Tessa's hand. Caleb stood behind them, checking his phone like numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. Tessa started before anyone sat down. I still don't understand why we need witnesses for a family conversation. Her voice shook, but not from fear. From offense. She looked at Nadine's folder, then at me. You could have just talked to us. I almost laughed, but nothing about that room was funny. Reverend Pike folded his hands. We are here because talking has not produced honesty, he said gently. Then he looked at my father. Russell, your daughter asked that you begin. My father stared at the carpet. For several seconds, all I could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioner and Beverly's uneven breathing. Nadine did not open the folder. She did not rescue him. Neither did I. Finally, Russell said, "The house belongs to Mara." Tessa made a small sound, but he kept going. "The Porsche belongs to Mara. June left the property to her. I did not buy it. I did not pay for it. I let people think otherwise because it was easier than explaining the truth." "Easier for who?" I asked. He looked at me then, and for the first time since the party, he looked older than angry. "For me," he said. "After I retired, I didn't want people thinking I had nothing to show. I liked hearing them talk like I had provided more than I had." The words landed heavily, but they were not finished. Reverend Pike asked about the loan. Russell swallowed. I knew Tessa and Caleb wanted Mara's signature. I thought if she understood the pressure, she would help. "That is not what happened," Nadine said. "The email said she did not need to understand every detail." Beverly closed her eyes. Tessa began crying then, angry tears, the kind that ask for comfort before accountability. "So now I'm the villain because I needed help?" she said. I turned to her slowly. "No. You became responsible when my name, my house, and my son's security became part of a plan I was not allowed to fully understand." Caleb looked down at his phone again. Walter Briggs finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. "June knew who showed up. That's why she chose Mara." No one rushed to fill the silence after that. I looked at my father, then my mother, then my sister. "You all keep saying you were trying to keep the family from falling apart," I said. "Then why was I the only one expected to break?" For a long moment, no one answered me. Tessa cried into a tissue, as if tears could move the weight of what had been said onto someone else. Beverly rubbed her back. Caleb kept his eyes on the floor. My father sat with his hands clasped between his knees, looking at the table where Nadine's folder still remained closed. That was what made the room feel different. The proof was there, but for once, nobody could pretend the paper was the cruel part. Tessa was the first to speak. "I was desperate, Mara." Her voice cracked around my name. "You don't know what it feels like to have people depending on you, and everything falling apart." I looked at her carefully. "I know exactly what it feels like," I said. "I just never thought it gave me permission to gamble with someone else's home." She flinched, but I did not soften it. There are some truths that become less kind when you wrap them too gently. Caleb finally lifted his head. "The loan was never supposed to hurt you," he said. "It was just a short-term bridge." Nadine opened the folder then, only one page. "A bridge secured by property Mara did not agree to risk," she said. "From this point forward, you will not contact any lender, vendor, or financial institution using Mara's name, address, property, or presumed cooperation. If anything has already been submitted, it needs to be withdrawn and corrected in writing." Caleb nodded once, not because he was sorry, but because he understood consequences. My mother turned to me with red eyes. "Can't we handle this privately now?" she asked. "We have all been humiliated enough." I thought about that word. Humiliated. She had not used it when Eli heard her lie. She had not used it when Tessa chased my car. She had not used it when my father told me to leave. It only appeared once the truth had witnesses. "The truth is not humiliation," I said. The lie was. By the end of the meeting, the terms were plain. Russell and Beverly would account for every transfer from my accounts and begin repayment through a documented schedule. Tessa and Caleb would confirm in writing that my house would not be used in any loan, application, or business filing. My parents would send a correction to the relatives who attended the retirement party, stating that the Roanoke house and the Porsche were my separate property. Not family property. Not Russell's achievement. Mine. Beverly asked if the wording could be softer. Nadine looked at her and said, "Accuracy is not cruelty." My father did not argue. Maybe he was tired. Maybe, for the first time, he understood that authority does not survive contact with a signed deed, a bank record, and a daughter who is no longer willing to translate disrespect into peace. When we stood to leave, Russell said my name. I stopped, but I did not turn all the way back. "I didn't think you would take it this far," he said. I looked at him then. "That was the problem," I answered. "You never thought I would." 3 days after the meeting, Russell sent the correction email. He copied the relatives who had attended the retirement party and wrote plainly that the Roanoke house and the Porsche were my separate property, inherited and purchased through Grandma June's estate, not gifts from him and not assets anyone else had a right to discuss. Beverly did not add a Bible verse. Tessa did not reply. Caleb sent Nadine a short confirmation that no lender would receive my name, address, or property as part of any application. The money was harder. Russell signed a repayment schedule for the $18,740, but a signature did not make the hurt smaller. Every payment would be documented. Every missed payment would be handled through Nadine. I did not enjoy that. I did not want to become the daughter who needed paperwork to speak to her parents, but I had already learned what happened when I trusted feelings to protect facts. Eli asked about them on Thursday night while I folded his pajamas at Lydia's dining table. "Are Grandma and Grandpa still mad?" he asked. I sat beside him and kept my voice simple. "They are upset because the grown-ups have to fix something they did wrong." "You did nothing wrong." He looked down at his hands. "Did we get kicked out?" That question went straight through me. "No, baby," I said. "We left because Mommy needed everyone to be safe and honest." The next afternoon, Beverly asked to see him. Her text was longer than it needed to be, full of soft words like healing and family and moving forward. I read it twice, then wrote back with conditions. Visits had to be planned in advance. No adult arguments around Eli. No comments about the house, the car, money, or who owed whom. No using him to carry messages. No showing up at my door without an invitation. Love for my son would not be measured by who could push past me fastest. My mother called within 5 minutes. "So now we need permission to see our grandson?" she asked. Her voice had that old wounded edge, the one that used to make me apologize before I understood the charge. This time, I did not chase it. "You need permission to enter my home," I said. "You need trust to be close to my son. Those are not the same thing." She went quiet, and for once, I let the silence do its work. Russell was the first to follow the rules. He met us at a small park near Lydia's place on Saturday morning, arrived 10 minutes early, and waited by his truck until I waved him over. He brought no expensive toy, no speech, no demand that Eli hug him. He only sat beside the sandbox while Eli showed him how to build a road for plastic dinosaurs. When the visit ended, he looked at me and said, "I thought being your father meant I got the final word." I watched Eli run ahead toward Lydia, his small shoes flashing against the gravel path. Russell's voice dropped. "I forgot you became the one holding this family's roof together." I did not forgive him in that moment. Real forgiveness does not arrive just because someone finally says the right sentence. But I heard him. And after everything, hearing the truth without having to drag it out of someone felt like the first safe thing my father had given me in years. 10 months later, Eli turned 5 in the backyard I had once driven away from, with my hands locked around the steering wheel. I almost chose a park, somewhere neutral, somewhere without memories sitting in the corners. But Eli wanted the dogwood tree, the porch steps, and the patch of grass where Grandma June used to let him dig for worms with a spoon. So I said yes, not because everything was healed, but because the house did not deserve to be treated like the wound other people made inside it. Russell arrived early and asked where I wanted the folding table. He did not walk in through the back door without knocking. Beverly brought pasta salad in a glass bowl and waited on the porch until I invited her into the kitchen. Those were small things. A year earlier, I might have dismissed them as ordinary manners. Now I understood that safe people are often proven by ordinary manners repeated when no one is clapping. Tessa did not come at first. I saw her car slow near the curb, then keep going. 20 minutes later, my phone lit up with a message. "I'm not ready to be around everyone," it said. "But I know the house was never mine to discuss. Tell Eli happy birthday." I read it twice, then set the phone down. I did not answer right away. Part of healing was learning that every message did not require me to rush toward the person who had sent it. Eli spent the afternoon chasing bubbles across the lawn, while Russell sat with his paper plate balanced carefully on his knee. Beverly asked, before taking a picture. When someone mentioned how beautiful the house looked, my father said, "Mara has taken good care of it." No speech. No performance. Just one true sentence placed where a lie used to stand. It did not erase the driveway or the counseling room or the bank records. But truth, spoken without being dragged out, has its own quiet weight. Near sunset, Eli climbed into my lap and pointed toward the garage. "Is Aunt Tessa still mad about the Porsche?" he asked. I looked at the driveway where my sister had once screamed for me to leave what was never hers. "Maybe," I said. "But grown-ups being mad does not mean they get to take things." He nodded like that made sense, because children understand fairness long before adults start decorating it with excuses. The Porsche was still in my name, the house was still in my name, but that was not the victory. My victory was refusing to teach my son that keeping a family together requires one person to accept humiliation. It was protecting the home my grandmother trusted me with, the child who had watched me, and the woman I became when I finally stopped apologizing for telling the truth. What this story taught me is that family love should never require one person to disappear so everyone else can feel comfortable. For years, Mara thought peace meant staying quiet. She thought being the strong one meant absorbing the insult, forgiving before anyone apologized, and letting other people call her sacrifice family. But peace built on silence is not peace. It is only a room where the loudest people get to decide what truth is allowed to survive. Sometimes the people who hurt us are not strangers. Sometimes they are the people sitting at our table, using words like respect, loyalty, gratitude, and forgiveness, while asking us to give up the very things that keep us safe. And that is what makes it so painful. Because when betrayal comes from family, we do not just lose trust in them. We begin to question our own right to say no. But love without boundaries becomes permission. Forgiveness without accountability becomes a doorway for the same wound to walk back in. And family, real family, does not demand your home, your savings, your dignity, or your child's sense of safety just to protect someone else's pride. Mara's victory was not the Porsche. It was not even the house. Her real victory was the moment she stopped teaching her son that love means accepting humiliation. She showed him that truth can be spoken calmly, that strength does not have to shout, and that walking away is not always abandonment. Sometimes walking away is how you protect what still has a chance to heal. The hardest part of rebuilding after betrayal is understanding that changed words are not enough. Trust returns slowly, through repeated actions, through honesty when it is inconvenient, through respect when nobody is watching. Some relationships can heal. Some cannot. But either way, You are allowed to protect your peace while you wait to see who is willing to become safe. So if this story reminded you of your own family, your own silence, or a moment when you finally had to choose yourself, share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and someone else may need to hear that they are not alone. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, please subscribe and join me for the next one.